Topo Chico Prison was never supposed to become one of the most dangerous prisons on Earth. When it opened in 1943, it was built to house criminals, not to surrender authority to them. But over decades, Topo Chico transformed into something far more disturbing, a prison where the state lost control and organized crime took over from the inside. For years, Topo Chico was not run by guards. It was run by inmates. Located in Monterrey, one of Mexico's most important industrial cities, Topo Chico became a reflection of the country's wider struggle with corruption, cartel violence, and institutional collapse. What happened inside its walls was not an accident. It was the result of neglect, fear, and power slowly shifting away from the government. By the early 2000s, the prison was already overcrowded and understaffed. Guards were poorly paid, poorly trained, and heavily outnumbered. This imbalance created opportunity, and the cartels moved in. Inside Topo Chico, inmates formed structured criminal hierarchies. Leaders controlled cell blocks. Enforcers maintained order. Guards, rather than imposing authority, often negotiated with those in power. Bribes became routine. Rules became flexible. Control became symbolic. Inmates did not simply survive in Topo Chico, they governed. Entire sections of the prison operated like cartel territory. Prisoners paid rent for cells. Those with money lived in comfort, while others were forced into servitude. Violence was not random. It was organized, strategic, and deliberate. Weapons flowed freely inside the prison. Firearms, knives, grenades, items that should never exist behind bars, became part of daily life. Drugs were sold openly. Alcohol circulated freely. Money determined safety. The prison walls no longer separated inmates from the criminal world. They connected them. Topo Chico became a hub for cartel operations. From inside their cells, leaders ordered kidnappings, assassinations, and drug trafficking activities across northern Mexico. Phones were everywhere. Surveillance was minimal. The prison functioned less like a detention center and more like a fortified headquarters. Guards knew what was happening, but fear kept them silent. Attempting to enforce rules meant risking death. Some officers were threatened. Others were bribed. Many simply looked away. The state's authority eroded slowly, until it barely existed at all. By the time the outside world fully understood what Topo Chico had become, it was already too late. The prison housed rival cartel factions under the same roof. Tensions simmered constantly. Alliances shifted. Power struggles unfolded quietly, until they didn't. On the night of February 10, 2016, the fragile balance collapsed. A violent riot erupted between rival gangs inside the prison. Gunfire echoed through the cell blocks. Fires broke out. Explosions were reported. Inmates fought using firearms and improvised weapons, while guards struggled to respond. By the time order was restored, 49 inmates were dead. Many were burned alive. Others were shot at close range. Bodies were stacked in corridors. The massacre shocked Mexico and drew international attention. But for those who understood Topo Chico, the riot was not surprising. It was inevitable. Years of unchecked cartel control had turned the prison into a powder keg. The state had surrendered authority long before the violence exploded. The riot simply exposed what already existed. In the aftermath, investigators uncovered the full scale of corruption inside Topo Chico. Luxury cells equipped with air conditioning, televisions, and private bathrooms. Underground tunnels. Hidden armories. Cash stockpiles. Some inmates lived better inside prison than many citizens did outside. The revelations were humiliating for the Mexican government. Topo Chico became a symbol of failure, proof that even prisons were no longer under state control. Public outrage followed. Politicians promised reform. Investigations were launched. Officials were dismissed. But the damage was already done. Topo Chico's reputation was sealed. The prison continued operating for several more years, but its days were numbered. In 2019, authorities announced it would be permanently closed. Inmates were transferred. The gates were sealed. In 2020, Topo Chico Prison officially shut down. But closing the prison did not erase its legacy. What happened inside Topo Chico revealed a deeper truth about Mexico's prison system. Overcrowding, corruption, and cartel influence had created environments where criminal organizations could thrive behind bars. Topo Chico was not unique. It was simply the most visible. The prison demonstrated how quickly authority can collapse when institutions are weak and criminals are organized. It showed that walls and bars mean nothing if control is surrendered from within. 4 years, Topo Chico existed as a warning, ignored until it exploded. And to truly understand how such a prison could exist for so long, you have to look deeper into how cartel power works, how guards became powerless, and how fear replaced law inside those walls. Because Topo Chico was not just a prison failure. It was a system failure. And the story does not end here. Inside Topo Chico, daily life followed rules that were never written by the state. The official prison regulations still existed on paper, but inside the walls, a different system operated, one enforced by inmates themselves. Power was organized vertically. At the top were cartel leaders, men with connections, money, and the capacity for violence. Beneath them were lieutenants who managed sections of the prison, enforced discipline, and collected payments. At the bottom were inmates with no protection, no resources, and no leverage. This hierarchy dictated everything. Cells were not assigned by guards, they were bought. Inmates with money paid for space, privacy, and security. Some lived in converted rooms with beds, fans, televisions, even refrigerators. Others slept on concrete floors in overcrowded cells, vulnerable to extortion and assault. Protection was a commodity. Inmates who could not pay were forced to work for those who could. Some cleaned cells. Others ran errands. Some were coerced into smuggling drugs or weapons. Refusal was dangerous. Violence was swift and public, meant to reinforce obedience. The prison functioned like a cartel city. Drugs were sold openly. Alcohol circulated freely. Gambling operations ran daily. Prostitution existed inside the walls. Money flowed constantly, and where money flowed, control followed. Phones were everywhere. Inmates used them to coordinate operations outside the prison: kidnappings, extortion calls, drug shipments. From behind bars, cartel leaders continued running criminal networks across northern Mexico. Prison was not an interruption. It was an office. Guards were aware of this reality. Most were vastly outnumbered. Many were underpaid. Some were threatened. Others were bribed. The line between cooperation and survival blurred quickly. For guards, enforcing rules often meant risking death. Those who attempted to assert authority faced immediate consequences. Threats extended beyond the prison walls, targeting families and homes. Over time, many guards learned to coexist rather than confront. The state's presence became symbolic. Official counts and inspections were performed, but control remained with inmates. Certain areas of the prison were effectively off-limits to staff. Guards knew which doors not to open, which sections to avoid, which leaders not to challenge. This unspoken agreement maintained a fragile order. Violence was not constant, but it was always possible. Cartel leaders enforced discipline harshly to prevent chaos. Unapproved violence was punished. Unauthorized theft was dealt with internally. Order existed, but it was criminal order. This is what made Topo Chico so dangerous. The prison did not descend into chaos every day. It functioned, just not under state control. For inmates arriving at Topo Chico, the transition was immediate and brutal. New prisoners were assessed quickly. Those with money or cartel connections were absorbed into existing structures. Those without were exploited. There was no neutral ground. Survival depended on affiliation, resources, or submission. Inmates learned quickly who held power and who did not. Asking the wrong question or entering the wrong area could be fatal. Fear replaced law. The prison's infrastructure facilitated this takeover. Overcrowding made surveillance impossible. Narrow corridors and aging facilities created blind spots. Guards lacked equipment and backup. Cartels filled the vacuum. They provided structure where the state failed. They enforced rules where official authority collapsed. They controlled movement, discipline, and commerce inside the prison. But this control came at a cost. Rivalries between factions never disappeared. They were suppressed, managed, and postponed. Alliances shifted constantly. Tensions simmered beneath the surface. Topo Chico housed members of rival cartels under the same roof. The only thing preventing constant bloodshed was balance, and balance is fragile. As years passed, the prison became more militarized from within. Weapons stockpiles grew. Defensive positions were established. Certain areas were fortified. The prison evolved into a fortress controlled by criminals. When conflict finally erupted, It was devastating. The 2016 riot was not spontaneous. It was the result of long building pressure. A power struggle between rival factions escalated beyond control. Gunfire broke out. Fires spread. Explosions were reported. Guards were overwhelmed. By the time the Mexican military intervened, dozens were dead. The massacre exposed what many already knew but few had admitted. Topo Chico was no longer a prison. It was a battlefield. Investigations after the riot revealed the extent of the takeover. Authorities found weapons caches, luxury accommodations, underground passages, and financial records documenting extensive corruption. The revelations embarrassed the government. Public trust eroded. International attention followed. Topo Chico became a symbol of institutional failure, proof that the state had lost control even within its own prisons. Officials promised reform. New strategies were announced. Transfers were planned. But dismantling a criminal system that had taken decades to build was not simple. Cartel influence did not disappear overnight. 4 years after the riot, Topo Chico continued operating under increased scrutiny. Military presence increased. Some leaders were moved. Restrictions tightened. But the damage was permanent. In 2019, the decision was made to close the prison entirely. Authorities declared it beyond repair. Inmates were transferred to other facilities. The gates were sealed. In 2020, Topo Chico officially shut down. Yet its closure raised uncomfortable questions. If one prison could fall so completely under cartel control, how many others were already compromised? Was Topo Chico an anomaly or a warning? The truth was unsettling. Many of the conditions that allowed Topo Chico to exist still existed elsewhere. Overcrowding, corruption, underpaid staff, powerful criminal organizations. Topo Chico was not the disease. It was the symptom. And while the prison itself is now silent, the lessons it left behind remain loud. It showed how quickly authority can collapse when fear replaces law and when criminals are allowed to govern unchecked. It showed that walls and bars are meaningless if control is surrendered from within. And it proved that once power shifts inside a prison, reclaiming it comes at a terrible cost. This is the legacy of Topo Chico. And to understand why it happened, and whether it could happen again, we must examine the deeper forces that allowed a prison to become a cartel stronghold. Because Topo Chico did not fail alone. The system failed with it. After the riot, one question dominated every investigation into Topo Chico. How did guards survive inside a prison that was no longer under government control? The answer was uncomfortable. Most guards did not survive by enforcing authority. They survived by adapting to its absence. Inside Topo Chico, guards understood a truth that officials outside were slow to accept. They were no longer the most powerful people inside the prison. Attempting to reclaim control through force would have meant open war, and that war would have been lost quickly. Guards were outnumbered. They were underarmed. And many were known by name. Cartel leaders inside the prison had access to detailed information about staff, where they lived, who their families were, which routes they took home. Threats did not need to be shouted. They were implied. This created a system of fear that extended beyond the prison walls. For many guards, the choice was not between corruption and integrity. It was between cooperation and survival. Accepting bribes, ignoring contraband, and allowing inmate control became coping mechanisms rather than moral failures. Some guards resisted. Those who did were isolated, transferred, or forced to resign. In extreme cases, they were threatened into silence. The prison quietly selected for compliance. Over time, an unspoken agreement emerged. Guards maintained the illusion of state authority. Inmates maintained internal order. Violence was allowed only when sanctioned by those in power. This balance kept the prison functioning. Topo Chico's internal economy was central to maintaining this control. Money flowed constantly. Inmates paid for protection, comfort, and status. Those who could not pay became currency themselves. Entire businesses operated behind bars. Drug distribution networks mirrored those outside. Prices were regulated. Territory was enforced. Profits were shared up the hierarchy. Guards took their cut, either directly or indirectly. The prison did not just house criminals. It generated income. Phones were essential to this economy. Despite periodic crackdowns, thousands of mobile devices circulated freely. With them, inmates coordinated extortion schemes, ordered killings, and managed trafficking routes. From inside Topo Chico, Cartel leaders continued to shape violence across northern Mexico. The prison became an extension of the cartel world, not a break from it. This had devastating consequences for inmates without protection. Those who entered Topo Chico without money or connections faced immediate danger. They were targeted for extortion, forced labor, or worse. Some were beaten to enforce obedience. Others were assaulted to send messages. Reporting abuse was pointless. The official system had no reach. Survival depended on submission. For many inmates, the prison was more dangerous than the streets they came from. Inside, there were no neutral spaces. Every area was controlled by someone. Every movement was observed. Fear was constant. Yet paradoxically, this fear also created order. Random violence was bad for business. Cartel leaders understood that chaos threatened profit and power. Discipline was enforced internally. Unauthorized violence was punished. Theft without permission was dealt with. Disobedience was crushed quickly. This criminal governance created a distorted form of stability. From the outside, officials could point to days without incidents and claim progress. Inside, the reality was far darker. The 2016 riot shattered this illusion. When rival factions clashed, the balance collapsed. The violence was sudden and overwhelming. Firearms appeared instantly. Explosives were used. Fires spread uncontrollably. Guards retreated. The state lost the prison completely for hours. The massacre forced Mexico to confront what Topo Chico had become. Images of burned bodies and destroyed cell blocks circulated globally. The myth of control was gone. In response, the government deployed military forces, transferred key leaders, and announced reforms. But reclaiming authority after decades of surrender was nearly impossible. Cartel power does not dissolve quietly. Even as Topo Chico was placed under tighter supervision, its internal culture remained. Inmates adapted. New hierarchies formed. Control shifted, but it did not disappear. Closing the prison became the only option. When Topo Chico finally shut down in 2020, officials framed it as a victory, a symbol of reform, proof that the state was reclaiming authority. But closure raised a critical problem. Thousands of inmates were transferred to other prisons, carrying the same structures, loyalties, and habits with them. The cartel culture that had flourished inside Topo Chico did not die with the prison. It migrated. Other facilities absorbed former Topo Chico inmates, and with them came experience, influence, and expectations. In some cases, the same patterns began to emerge elsewhere. Topo Chico was gone, but the system that allowed it to exist remained. This reality forced a painful reckoning. Mexico's prison crisis was not about one facility. It was about chronic overcrowding, underfunding, and the immense power of organized crime. Prisons were not isolated institutions. They were embedded in a society where cartels held enormous influence. Walls could not stop that influence. Topo Chico revealed how incarceration alone cannot dismantle criminal networks. Without strong institutions, prisons become hubs rather than barriers. The prison's legacy is therefore not just one of horror, but of warning. It showed what happens when fear replaces law, when corruption becomes routine, when authority retreats instead of confronting power. It showed that prisons can become fortresses for crime rather than tools against it. And it raised a question that still haunts Mexico's justice system. If a prison can be taken over so completely, how many others are already compromised? Topo Chico answered that question in blood. And its story remains one of the clearest examples of what happens when the state loses control from the inside out. After Topo Chico shut its gates for the final time, the silence it left behind was misleading. The prison was gone, but the forces that shaped it were not. In many ways, Topo Chico became a blueprint, a case study in how prisons collapse when criminal power is allowed to replace state authority. For Mexico's prison system, the closure marked the end of one chapter, not the end of the story. Former Topo Chico inmates were redistributed across the country. Some were transferred to newer facilities designed with stronger security measures. Others were sent to already overcrowded prisons struggling with their own internal challenges. Wherever they went, they carried experience. They understood how to organize behind bars, how to exploit weak oversight, how to establish hierarchies, how to turn confinement into opportunity. The culture forged inside Topo Chico did not vanish, it adapted. This migration exposed a deeper truth. Prisons do not exist in isolation. They reflect the balance of power outside their walls. When criminal organizations dominate streets, they eventually dominate cells. Topo Chico's downfall was accelerated by overcrowding. Designed to hold far fewer inmates than it ultimately housed, the prison became unmanageable. Cells built for a handful of prisoners held dozens. Guards could not monitor every corner. Blind spots multiplied. Overcrowding is not just a logistical problem. It erodes authority. When too many people are confined without adequate supervision, informal systems emerge. Someone fills the vacuum. At Topo Chico, that someone was the cartels. Corruption followed predictably. Underpaid staff faced immense pressure. Accepting bribes became normalized. Smuggling contraband became routine. Enforcement became selective. Over time, corruption stopped being an exception. It became the system. The prison's internal governance mirrored cartel structure outside. Leaders delegated authority. Enforcers maintained order. Violence was strategic. Chaos was bad for business. This criminal governance created the illusion of stability, a prison that functioned despite state absence. But stability under criminal rule is fragile. Rivalries never disappear. They wait. They harden. They prepare. The 2016 riot was the moment when suppressed conflict broke free. Years of tension exploded in hours. The massacre was not an anomaly. It was the inevitable outcome of a system built on fear and power rather than law. The response to the riot exposed the limits of reform. Military intervention restored order temporarily, but it could not erase years of surrender. Authority regained through force alone is temporary. Long-term control requires legitimacy. Topo Chico lacked legitimacy long before it collapsed. Inmates did not recognize the state as the ultimate authority. Guards did not enforce rules with confidence. The prison existed in a gray zone where power was negotiated daily. Closing the prison avoided confronting this reality head-on. By sealing the gates, the government removed a symbol of failure, but symbols do not cause problems. Systems do. Mexico's broader prison crisis remained. Other facilities faced similar challenges: overcrowding, corruption, cartel influence. Some had already developed inmate hierarchies. Others teetered on the edge. Topo Chico simply made the problem impossible to ignore. International observers took notice. Reports highlighted how incarceration alone could not dismantle organized crime. In fact, poorly managed prisons strengthened it. Prisons became recruitment centers, training grounds, command posts. This dynamic reshaped how crime functioned nationally. Cartel leaders learned that prison did not end influence. It shifted it. From behind bars, they could operate with reduced risk, protected by walls and corruption. This realization changed criminal strategy. Incarceration became less feared. Leaders planned for prison as part of career trajectory. Control inside became as important as control outside. Topo Chico exemplified this evolution. Inside its walls, criminal power did not weaken. It consolidated. The prison also exposed the human cost of systemic failure. Inmates without cartel protection suffered the most. They were exploited, assaulted, and silenced. Their experiences rarely reached public attention. Families of victims faced a justice system that could not protect even those already in custody. Guards, too, paid a price. Many lived under constant threat. Some left the profession traumatized. Others remained trapped in a system that demanded compromise for survival. Topo Chico was brutal not just because of violence, but because of normalization. Horror became routine. Survival required acceptance. When the prison closed, officials promised that lessons had been learned. New facilities were built. Policies were revised. Oversight increased. But structural problems proved resistant to quick solutions. Overcrowding persisted. Cartel power remained. Corruption adapted. Topo Chico's legacy lingered as a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when institutions decay slowly and invisibly until collapse is sudden and irreversible. The prison's transformation did not happen overnight. It took decades. Each compromise weakened authority slightly. Each ignored warning strengthened criminal control. By the time violence exploded, the outcome was already determined. Topo Chico forces a difficult question. Can a prison system function effectively in a society where criminal organizations wield enormous power? Walls alone are not enough. Guards alone are not enough. Laws alone are not enough. Without strong institutions, prisons become mirrors of the chaos they are meant to contain. Topo Chico was one such mirror. Its story reveals that incarceration without control does not stop crime. It reorganizes it. The prison was not a failure of architecture or policy alone. It was a failure of will, oversight, and sustained commitment. And while Topo Chico is gone, the conditions that created it still demand attention. Because the next Topo Chico will not announce itself. It will grow quietly, behind walls meant to prevent exactly that. And when it finally reveals itself, it will already be too late. Topo Chico no longer holds inmates. Its gates are locked. Its cell blocks are silent. But silence does not mean resolution. What happened inside those walls did not begin with a riot, and it did not end with closure. It unfolded slowly, through neglect, fear, and surrender. Year by year, authority retreated. Criminal power advanced. And eventually, the prison stopped being a prison at all. Topo Chico became proof that walls alone do not create control. When the state withdraws, whether through corruption, fear, or indifference, something else takes its place. At Topo Chico, that replacement was organized crime. Cartels filled every vacuum. They governed daily life, enforced rules, punished disobedience, and turned confinement into opportunity. The 2016 massacre did not expose chaos. It exposed structure, a structure built on violence, money, and intimidation, allowed to grow unchecked for decades. Closing the prison removed a symbol, but symbols are not systems. The conditions that allowed Topo Chico to exist still challenge prison systems far beyond Monterrey. Overcrowding, underpaid staff, corruption, and powerful criminal networks remain unresolved realities. Topo Chico forces an uncomfortable truth into the open. Incarceration does not automatically weaken criminal organizations. Without strong institutions, it can strengthen them. For the inmates who lived without protection, Topo Chico was not a place of punishment, it was a place of survival. For guards, it was a daily negotiation between duty and danger. For the state, it was a slow loss of authority that went unnoticed until it could no longer be denied. The prison's legacy is not found in its abandoned corridors. It lives in the lessons it left behind. It shows what happens when fear replaces law, when compromise becomes policy, when control is assumed instead of enforced. Topo Chico did not collapse suddenly. It eroded quietly, one ignored warning at a time. And that is what makes its story so dangerous. Because prisons rarely fail loudly at first. They fail in silence. They fail when systems weaken gradually, when oversight fades, and when criminal power adapts faster than institutions can respond. Topo Chico reminds us that control is not permanent. It must be maintained, defended, and enforced every day. Once surrendered, reclaiming it comes at an extraordinary cost. The prison is gone. The warning remains. And the question it leaves behind is not about the past, but the future. If it happened here, how many other prisons are already following the same path, unseen, until it's too late?